Depth Works, on Book 11, Stay the Course. A Depth Works original audiobook. Introduction. The thing we keep abandoning. There is a version of your life that only exists on the other side of not quitting. Most people never find it. Not because they lack talent, intelligence, or opportunity. Not because the odds were stacked against them. But because at some point along the way, they stopped. They paused. They drifted. And then slowly and almost without noticing, they turned around. We live in a world that celebrates starting. We celebrate the launch, the announcement, the first day. We take photos at the beginning and we share them with the world. But there are very few celebrations for the middle. Nobody posts about month 14 of a business that hasn't turned a profit yet. Nobody celebrates the 200th day of writing before anyone read it. Nobody cheers for the quiet, unglamorous act of still being there. And so we start a lot of things, and we finish very few of them. This book is about closing that gap. It is about what it takes to stay. Not because staying is always right, but because far too often we leave before we ever find out. It is about understanding why we quit, what it costs us, and how to build the kind of inner architecture that keeps us moving when everything in us wants to stop. Staying the course is not stubbornness. It is not blind persistence for its own sake. It is a deliberate choice made again and again to trust the process you have chosen long enough to see where it actually leads. This is what separates the people who get there from the people who almost did. Chapter 1. Why we quit. Before we can talk about staying, we need to understand leaving. Quitting is not always dramatic. It rarely happens in a single moment of surrender. More often, it happens gradually, through small withdrawals, through days skipped, through energy redirected, through enthusiasm quietly replaced by doubt. You don't decide to quit. You just stop deciding to continue. There are a handful of patterns that show up again and again in the stories of people who abandon things they genuinely wanted to build. The first is the gap. There is always a gap between where you imagined you would be and where you actually are. You had a vision of what this would look like by now. You had a timeline in your head, even if you never wrote it down. And when reality falls short of the picture, and it always does, at least initially, the gap becomes intolerable. The gap feels like evidence that it isn't working, that you aren't good enough, that the whole thing was a mistake. But the gap is not evidence of failure. The gap is simply the space where real work happens. The second pattern is comparison. You look around and see other people moving faster, other people getting results earlier, other people making it look easier. And because you can only see their highlights and not their struggles, the comparison is always unfair. You are comparing your raw footage to their final cut. You are measuring your effort against their outcome. This is one of the most reliable ways to convince yourself to stop doing something worth doing. The third pattern is the loss of the early feeling. When you start something, there is an energy to it, a sense of possibility, of newness, of excitement. But that feeling was never meant to last. It was the fuel that got you started, not the fuel that would carry you through. The problem is that when the feeling fades, we mistake its absence for a sign. We think it means we chose the wrong path, or that we have fallen out of love with the thing. But discipline and commitment do not feel the same as excitement. They are quieter, less dramatic, less immediately rewarding. And if we only continue doing things that feel exciting, we will never finish anything that matters. The fourth is comfort. Quitting is often the most comfortable short-term option. The resistance drops away. The pressure lifts. The anxiety quiets. And because comfort feels like relief, we misread it as correctness. But comfort is not always a signal that you have made the right call. Sometimes it is simply the relief of avoidance. The problem returns always because the thing you abandoned still exists. The gap still exists. The vision still exists. Only now there is the added weight of having left. Understanding why we quit is not about judging ourselves. It is about catching the pattern early enough to choose differently. Chapter 2. The compounding effect of consistency. One of the most misunderstood concepts in building anything meaningful is compounding. We understand it intellectually. We know that small actions, repeated consistently over time, produce results disproportionate to any single effort. We know this about money. We know it about fitness. We know it about learning. And yet we consistently underestimate just how long it takes for compounding to become visible, and we consistently overestimate how much any single action matters. The result is that we abandon processes just before they begin to pay off. Compounding is invisible at the beginning. The first months of nearly any worthwhile endeavor look flat. The graph of progress barely moves. And because we are wired to look for immediate feedback, because our brains are designed to respond to visible signals of progress, the flatness feels like failure. We interpret the absence of visible results as evidence that what we are doing is not working. But underneath that flat line, something is being built. Foundations are being laid. Habits are being wired in. Skills are being developed at a level that has not yet surfaced into the visible. The work is compounding, silently, underneath the surface of what you can measure. And then, at some point, the curve bends. Not dramatically at first, but it bends. And then it bends again. And then the compounding that was happening invisibly for months or years becomes suddenly, undeniably visible. The results start appearing faster than the effort seems to justify. This is not luck. This is the payoff of everything that came before. The tragedy is that most people quit just before the bend. They look at the flat line and they conclude that the process is broken. They try a different approach, or they abandon the goal entirely and they reset the clock. They start the compounding process again from zero. Consistency, it turns out, is not about discipline in the moment. It is about having a long enough horizon. It is about deciding in advance that you will not measure the value of today's effort by today's results, that you will instead measure it by the cumulative direction it contributes to. A single brick placed well every day does not look like a wall on day 1, or day 10, or even day 50. But on day 500, you are standing in front of something solid and real and yours. Stay long enough to see the bend in the curve. Chapter 3. Redefining Progress. One of the most powerful things you can do to stay on a long path is to change what you count as progress. Most of us measure progress in outcomes. Did the number go up? Did the audience grow? Did the revenue increase? Did the result appear? And when outcomes are not yet visible, we conclude that progress is not happening. But outcomes are a lagging indicator. They are the last thing to show up, not the first. And if we only count outcomes, we will perpetually feel like we are behind. There is another kind of progress, process progress, that is always available, regardless of where the outcome numbers sit. Process progress is the improvement in your craft, your thinking, your consistency, your understanding. It is the compounding of skill and judgment that happens every time you do the work, whether or not the results are yet visible. When you shift your primary measure of progress from outcomes to process, something important happens. You become much more accurate about where you actually are. You notice things you were missing before. You see the real improvements happening underneath the surface. And you find, almost always, that more is happening than you thought. Redefining progress also means changing your relationship with setbacks. A setback in outcomes, a bad month, a lost client, a failed launch, feels devastating when outcomes are your only measure. But a setback measured against process often tells a different story. Did you stay consistent through it? Did you learn something? Did your response show more resilience than last time? Those are forms of progress that a revenue chart will never show you. This is not about lowering standards or pretending that results don't matter. They do. But results are the product of a long chain of smaller improvements and decisions. And if you only track the end of that chain, you miss most of the story. Build your own scoreboard. Decide what counts. Make sure some of what counts is always within your control. Chapter 4. Dealing with Doubt. Doubt is not the enemy of commitment. Doubt is part of it. There is a persistent and damaging myth that the people who stay the course do so because they never doubt, because they have a certainty that others lack, because they wake up every day filled with conviction and purpose, and they never once wonder if they are wasting their time. This myth is not just wrong, it is dangerous. Because when doubt arrives, as it always does, people who believe this myth interpret it as a signal that they are not cut out for this, that the doubt itself is the verdict. But every person who has ever built something difficult has spent significant time in doubt. The doubt is not the sign that you are on the wrong path. The doubt is the sign that you are on a hard one. The question is not whether doubt will come. It will. The question is what you do when it arrives. The first step is to stop treating doubt as a verdict. Doubt is information, not conclusion. It tells you that you are uncertain, not that you are wrong. It tells you that you cannot see the outcome clearly from where you stand, not that the outcome is bad. When you learn to treat doubt as information rather than verdict, you stop needing to resolve it before you can move forward. You can carry it with you and keep going anyway. The second step is to separate doubt from decision. Most of the time, doubt feels like it demands an immediate response, like you need to make a decision right now, while the doubt is loudest. But this is almost never true. Doubt tends to peak and then subside. If you make your biggest decisions at the peak of your doubt, you will consistently make them under the worst possible conditions. The better practice is to let the wave pass before you decide anything. Act on your commitments, revisit the strategy when you are calmer. The third step is to find people who have been where you are. Not people who will reassure you that everything is fine, but people who have felt this exact doubt and kept going anyway. Their existence is one of the most powerful antidotes to the feeling that doubt means stop. Doubt is not your enemy. It is the proof that what you are doing matters enough to be uncertain about. Chapter 5. Building Rituals That Hold You. Motivation is weather. It changes. Rituals are infrastructure. They hold. This is one of the most practical distinctions in any long-term endeavor. Motivation is useful. The energy of wanting something, the excitement of a fresh start, the clarity of a strong why. These are real and valuable, but they are not reliable. They fluctuate with mood and circumstance and sleep and the small frustrations of daily life. And if your consistency depends on motivation, your consistency will be as unreliable as motivation is. Rituals work differently. A ritual is a behavior that has been anchored so thoroughly into your routine that it requires almost no decision-making. You do not ask yourself whether you feel like it. You do not negotiate with the part of you that wants to rest. You simply do it because it is the thing you do at this time, in this place, under these conditions. Building a ritual takes time. Anchoring is the process of attaching a new behavior to an existing one, so that the existing behavior becomes the trigger. You do not try to create a new time slot for the new action. You attach it to something already solid. You write after coffee. You review your work before you close the laptop. You take the walk after the call. The anchor does the heavy lifting of getting you started. And starting is always the hardest part. Rituals also have a defensive function. They protect your most important work from the endless expansion of everything else. Without ritual, your most important work will always be what gets cut when things get busy, because it is the thing that does not shout. It does not send you notifications. It does not have a deadline enforced by anyone else. The ritual is the artificial structure that gives it the same weight as the things that demand your attention. What rituals hold your most important work in place? If you cannot answer that clearly, the work is probably being crowded out by things that matter less. Design your rituals with care. They are the architecture of your long game. Chapter 6. When to Pivot and When to Push. Not everything you start deserves to be finished. This is important to say clearly, because any honest treatment of staying the course has to include a serious examination of when leaving is actually the right call. Persistence is a virtue only in the service of something worthy. Staying on a wrong path longer does not make it the right path. And one of the most difficult skills in any long-term endeavor is learning to distinguish between resistance the natural friction of difficult work, and genuine misalignment, the signal that this particular path is not actually the right one for you. There are a few questions that can help make this distinction. First, have you actually tested it? Many people abandon things before they have given them a fair trial. They quit after 2 months what required 2 years to evaluate. If you have not been consistent enough for long enough to generate real signal, you are not making a data-informed decision. You are making an emotion-informed one. Second, is the feedback structural or cyclical? All paths have low points. The question is whether the low point you are in is a cycle, something that will pass with time and continued effort, or a structural flaw in the approach itself. Cyclical lows should be ridden out. Structural flaws should be addressed. Third, what specifically is not working? The more specific you can be, the more useful the answer. Nothing is working is almost never accurate. Something is working, something is not. When you get specific, you often find that what needs to change is narrower than you thought, and that a focused adjustment, not an exit, is what is called for. Fourth, are you quitting towards something or just away from discomfort? Quitting towards something, a clearer opportunity, a better aligned path, a decision based on evidence, is different from quitting away from the hard feeling of a difficult stretch. One is strategic. The other is relief dressed as wisdom. Stay when the evidence says stay. Move when the evidence says move. But make sure it is evidence you are listening to, not just the part of you that wants the discomfort to stop. Chapter 7. The Cost of Starting Over. Every time you abandon something and start something new, you pay a price that rarely appears in the ledger. The visible cost of quitting is the loss of whatever you had built, the hours invested, the relationships developed, the skills acquired in that specific context. These are real costs, and most people acknowledge them at least partially. But the invisible costs are just as significant, and they are rarely counted. The first invisible cost is the reset of compounding. Every new start begins the compounding clock again from zero. All the foundation laid in the previous effort does not transfer. The reputation you were building, the audience you were growing, the skill curve you were ascending, these belong to the thing you left. When you start over, you start from the flat part of the curve again. The second invisible cost is the pattern. Every time you abandon something before it matures, you strengthen the pattern of abandonment. You train the part of yourself that makes decisions to expect that when things get hard, you will leave. And that expectation shapes the future. The next time you start something and it gets hard, and it will, the pattern fires earlier. The story you tell yourself about quitting becomes more practiced, more convincing, more available. The third invisible cost is the erosion of self-trust. Self-trust is built through following through. Every time you say you will do something and you do it, the trust you have in yourself deepens. Every time you commit to something and abandon it, the trust erodes a little. Over time, this erosion affects your willingness to invest fully in new things. You hedge, you hold back, you half commit, because you have learned through accumulated evidence that your commitments are not always reliable. This is one of the subtlest and most damaging consequences of the pattern of starting over. None of this means you should never leave something, but the costs of leaving are higher than they appear, and they compound in the wrong direction. Count the full price before you decide to pay it. Chapter 8. Finishing as a practice. Finishing is a skill. Like any skill, it can be developed deliberately through repeated practice at smaller scales. Most people approach finishing as a destination, something that happens at the end of a long effort. But finishing is also a habit, a posture, a set of micro decisions made throughout the process of doing anything. The people who reliably finish big things are, almost universally, the people who have practiced finishing small things so many times that the habit is deeply embedded. This is why the size of the thing you finish matters less than the frequency. Finishing a 30-minute project today builds the same neural architecture as finishing a 30-month one. The brain does not distinguish by scale. It responds to the experience of completion, of declaring something done, closing the loop, moving to the next thing with a clean slate. That experience, repeated enough times, rewires your default approach to work. There are a few practices that strengthen the finishing habit. The first is defining done. You cannot finish something you cannot define. Before you start anything, even a small task, get clear on what done looks like. Not approximately, specifically. The more clearly you define the endpoint, the less opportunity there is for the work to expand indefinitely and leave you in the exhausting middle forever. The second practice is finishing small things deliberately. Look for the incomplete items in your work and life. The conversations that were never properly closed, the projects in half-draft state, the tasks still open from weeks ago. These incomplete loops drain energy. Closing them, even the small ones, builds momentum and trains the finishing reflex. The third practice is celebrating completion. We are inconsistent about this. We push to the end and then immediately move to the next thing, skipping the moment of acknowledgement entirely. But the brain needs to register the win. Take a moment, note what you finished. Let the completion land before you move on. This closes the loop psychologically, not just practically, and it reinforces the connection between effort and satisfaction that keeps the cycle going. Finishing is not a talent you have or do not have. It is a practice you build, one completed thing at a time. Conclusion, the other side. There is a version of your life that only exists on the other side of not quitting. We said that at the beginning, and it deserves to be said again here, because now you have more context for what it means. It does not mean that every path you start is worth staying on forever. It does not mean that stubbornness is a virtue or that knowing when to leave is not its own form of wisdom. It means that most of the time, when the urge to quit arrives, it arrives too early, before the compound curve bends, before the skill becomes visible, before the effort becomes results, before the real shape of the thing becomes clear. The other side is not a place of ease. It is not where the hard work ends. It is where the hard work becomes undeniably worth it, where the thing you were building for all that time becomes real enough to touch, where the gap between the vision and the reality finally begins to close. Most people do not reach the other side, not because they lack the ability, but because they stopped walking before they arrived. You know now what quitting costs. You know how compounding works. You know how to build rituals that hold you. You know how to carry doubt without letting it steer. You know how to redefine progress in ways that are always available, even when outcomes lag. You know the difference between a pivot worth making and relief dressed as wisdom. You have everything you need to stay, so stay. When it is hard, stay. When it is quiet, stay. When others have moved on and the room feels empty, stay. Not because giving up is never right, but because you have not yet found out what is waiting on the other side. Key takeaways. We quit most often, not in one dramatic moment, but through a slow drift of disengagement. Catching the pattern early is the first act of staying. Compounding is invisible at the beginning. The results you are not yet seeing are being built by the work you are doing now. Most people quit just before the curve bends. Measuring only outcomes will make you feel behind constantly. Build a scoreboard that includes process, consistency, skill development, resilience, and your progress becomes visible long before the results arrive. Doubt is not a verdict, it is information. The people who finish things are not the ones who never doubt. They are the ones who learn to carry doubt and keep moving. Rituals are more reliable than motivation. Anchor your most important work to existing habits so it happens regardless of how you feel. Not everything deserves to be finished. But before you leave, ask honestly whether you are quitting towards something better or simply away from discomfort. Every time you start over, the compounding clock resets. Count the full invisible cost before you pay it. Finishing is a practice, not a talent. Build it at small scale first. Define done clearly. Celebrate completion deliberately. A note at the end. If you made it to the end of this, you have already demonstrated something. You stayed. Through chapters that may have felt too familiar, through moments that perhaps landed a little too close, through ideas you may have heard before, but needed to hear again in a different voice. That is not a small thing. The work of staying, really staying, not just enduring, is some of the most important work you will ever do. Not because the destination always justifies the journey, But because the act of choosing to continue again and again shapes the person you become far more than the destination ever will. Thank you for listening. Whatever you are in the middle of right now, keep going.